precisely 2,000 words of it. That book is never coming. Hopefully others will in their place. I apologize in advance. I've been in and out of hospital as usual this week, and so very nearly ended up cancelling, but thought I'd already been such a pain to Peter and Donovan in terms of accommodating my difficult time constraints that there would probably be nothing to lose by just waffling incoherently at you for 20 odd minutes anyway. The result of what I'll talk about today then is that I've probably got about 1,500 words of written text, and I'll extemporize around the rest. But I wanted to focus on this side of things rather than pulling out an alternative, because it really emerges out of a lot of the conversations that Bernard and I were having back in April. There was a time when we were both hospitalized, me with dialysis. He was going through some really nasty intestinal sepsis. And we were speaking for about an hour a day for 10 days or so while we both had nothing else to do. Although I say that, Bernard was writing about 5,000 words a day, despite barely being able to speak at the time. And we'd really kind of settled on the direction where we wanted to be taking our work over the next couple of years, which was to be focusing on the interrelation of biodiversity with neurodiversity, which is to say the variety and internal to both technical systems and corresponding modes of thought and experience, and the idea that a collapse in neurodiversity would be every bit as significant as a collapse in biodiversity, and we'd be linking this in turn to what Yukui calls technodiversity as well. Now, you won't see much of that in what I'll talk about in a couple of minutes, but it really sets this up, and it sets up something that Peter also alluded to, which was Bernard's growing interest in Peter Sloterdijk and the transition between questions of health that we derive from Georges Canguilhem into what we might, drawing on people like Daniel Pradeux, talk about an extended concept of immunology. So Sloterdijk has what often gets described, actually particularly by Dutch-speaking authors, as a rather outdated notion of immunology, gravitating around the friend-enemy, insider-outsider distinction. But I think what we really start to see with Bernard, and he'll be intersecting nicely, not just with people like Catherine Malabou, but with Byung-Chul Han as well here, is the extent to which we can pose contemporary questions around the politics of organology in terms of life systems collapsing in on themselves. Now, that's really the direction that I want to push in a little bit today. And I want to do that by picking up on a concept that Bernard never said a great deal about, but which was always hovering in the background of his work and really started to come. I mean, we've seen this. Peter mentioned it already with negantropy. You see these little flashes of words that appear 5 years in advance in Bernard's work, and then they start to get thematized increasingly into the point where he's really decided what he wants to do with them. I regret that we'll probably ultimately never know the direction in which he would have taken his concept of intermittence, the intermittency of life. I don't think that we can expect a great deal forthcoming in the archives on that particular concept. But nonetheless, I think it really is one of the most interesting that emerges out of Bernard's work, for reasons that I'll try to go into today. But as I say, I'll really be alternating here between written text and extemporization. So please do forgive me in advance for that. So I've called this these extracts of a paper then, COVID-19 and the Intermittent Society. Intermittence was one of Bernard Stiegler's most fascinating but under-recognized concepts. He rejected the category of the human in favor of saying that we are only ever intermittently not inhuman, which is to say, predominantly governed by habituated drives, both organic and technologically inculcated, but capable of occasional moments of disautomation when we glimpse something like the promise of neganthropic humanity. Stiegler's late work on the economy of contribution also drew heavily on intermittence, being modelled on the structuring of unemployment payments to intermittents du spectacle, or artists who rotate in and out of paid work. The concept becomes all the more significant in the context of COVID-19, which has shut down vast swathes of society and forced us into protective hibernation, with devastating impact for both localities and the global economy. And yet we can see COVID-19 as stemming from the refusal of intermittence on account of an ideology of work and as endless productivity, which is in turn equated with life itself. It's this ideology that has left us, the exhausted sedentary workers of the burned out automatic society, with baseline levels of inflammation that leaves us dangerously susceptible to the fatal cytokine storms that we now think are one of the major causes of what makes SARS-CoV-2 so dangerous. Increasingly pronounced and unavoidable climatic perturbations of the ever more inescapable Anthropocene, like wildfires, floods, and similar new zoonotic diseases to coronavirus, to say nothing of our susceptibility to collapsing biodiversity and the envisaged breakdown of social systems already overly dependent on the technological monoculture of the electricity grid and the internet. These kinds of increasingly unavoidable climatic perturbations threaten to make the intermittency of society the new norm. To learn to live with this threat, and as a step towards the bifurcation needed for the neganthropocene, we might start, I'll suggest, by reorganizing society around our own intermittent non-humanity. But I have to say, I'm not going to be able to go much further today than simply posing that as a question and necessity and offering some relatively vacuous platitudes on the need to curtail this ideology of endless work. I don't have anything more profound to say about this than that for the time being. I wonder, though, if we might start with a quotation from Nobel Harari's *Sapiens*, the major bestseller of 2014. I quote here from Harari: "Rather than heralding a new era of easy living, the agricultural revolution left farmers with lives generally more difficult and less satisfying than those of foragers. Hunter-gatherers spent their time in more stimulating and varied ways and were less in danger of starvation and disease. The agricultural revolution certainly enlarged the sum total of food at the disposal of humankind, but the extra food did not translate into a better diet or more leisure. Rather, it translated into population explosions and pampered elites. The average farmer worked harder than the average forager and got a worse diet in return. The agricultural revolution was history's biggest fraud." Perhaps the central contention of Yuval Noah Harari's unexpected bestseller *Sapiens* is that human civilization bifurcated for the worse around 10,000 years ago, at the time of the Neolithic or First Agricultural Revolution. Harari describes how, prior to the settling of agriculture, our hunter-gatherer ancestors would have spent just a few hours per day in a rather leisurely pursuit of food, a variety of foraged fruits, seeds, and meats, whose nutritional value far outstripped what we have endured for the subsequent majority of our subsequent cultural history. Wheat, however, changed everything. When wheat came along, its cultivation demanded vast quantities of backbreaking labour, while our dependence on a monocultural carbohydrate diet led to mineral deficiencies, plus heightened susceptibility to drought and immunological weakness. In permanent settlements that would be hotbeds, I'm quoting here, permanent settlements that would be hotbeds for infectious diseases. We get an allusion to what we'll have with something like mega agriculture and COVID-19 there too. I'll come back to that in due course. If the bifurcation of wheat-based society had been sudden, then we might have noticed its effects with enough time to change our minds, but its advent played out by a gradual decrease in infant mortality, the deferral of which only until later childhood coincided with a corresponding growth of anxiety in the face of death. The fateful miscalculation to transition to sedentary agriculture worked as a trap, habituating, and we might even say automating, Neolithic peoples into routines of living and expectations of imagined luxury, to which they clung well past the point of its costs outweighing its benefits. Leaning on this illusion to consumption past the point of displeasure, we might tentatively wonder whether our Neolithic predecessors became addicted to wheat, an idea not out of line with contemporary research into the cravings induced by carbohydrates, and which would moreover map neatly onto the need for an anxiolytic to dampen the bodily stresses caused by new regimes of relentless agricultural labour. The proposal would also fit with Fred Previk's positing of a spurt in our ancestors' levels of dependence on the neurotransmitter linked to both addiction and our capacity to regulate anxiety, namely dopamine. And it would point too to a cumulative step in the emergence of the stressful mode of proximate populous living that Previk classifies as dopaminergic society. I'm really referring to here to the chapter that we did in Bifurqué, published this summer, where we really pick up on the idea that something like climate change can be seen as the product of a society addicted to consumption, responding to the cumulative stresses of social dislocation, which we can trace across a long history, moving from dopaminergic society to what Previk calls hyperdopaminergic society. In other words, the neurotransmitter dopamine, one through which we heavily linked not just to learning and our capacity to adapt to environmental change, and which becomes increasingly dominant in the striatum over the course of the last 10,000 years or so, culminating in a rupture around 50 years or so ago that Previk will describe as the transition into hyper-dopaminergic society. Anyway, so we posit then that the shift into the sedentary agriculture of wheat might begin around the time of what Previk calls the onset of dopaminergic society. But more interesting still, though, I'd suggest, is how Yuval Noah Harari's identification of our bifurcatory erring into settled agriculture marks a step away from what we might, building on the work of Bernard Stiegler, call the intermittence of life. Without wishing to romanticize, perhaps Neolithic times in the Fertile Crescent gave us the original prelapsarian intermittent society, one alternating between the punctual work of foraging and a default state of leisure, echoing Karl Marx's reveries of hunting in the morning, fishing in the afternoon, and criticizing after dinner. A similarly default position of indolence might even look like the baseline activity or inactivity of all life. I say this drawing on the extremely interesting work of one of my PhD students, Pierluca D'Amato, whose project is arguing that all life tends towards dormancy and the minimization of entropic collapse, punctuated by moments of neganthropic activity. And we see this from the cryptobiosis of the tardigrade. We know those little water bears that live in the Arctic and can stay dormant for hundreds of years at a time or some such like. We see that intermittency of life, not just in the cryptobiosis of the tardigrade, but in both estivation, the hibernation of amphibious and mammalian life forms. We humans, or not in human animals, as Stiegler would call us, however, would appear to be the exception to this intermittency of life, though for reasons that are predominantly and perhaps even purely cultural. Sedentary farming may have facilitated a shift into the intermittence of seasonal rotation, but in time that too would begin to disappear. Jonathan Crary has written of the looming 24/7 capitalism in which even sleep is aufgehoben or sublated, if not by a new wave of digital automata, then by pharmaceuticals that bring us ever closer to the fantasy of purely mechanized human labor, stripped of its need for sleep and repose. But I'd suggest that we should see the advent of 24/7 category that Crowley discusses, stemming in turn as an extension of what Davide Terrizzo has described as a messily metaphysicalized concept of life that leaves little room, little space for intermittence. This is the concept of numeral life distinct from the individual lives of living creatures, and which emerges first through a Kantian Hegelian tradition of perfectibility and dutiful self-actualization through labor, before passing into the struggles of Darwinian competition. Unfortunately, we've neither the time nor the space to reconstruct a genealogy of this vital concept here. The considerable task of rereading Davide Terrizzo, along with Eugene Thacker and company, not to mention Francesco de Vitale's biodeconstruction, reading all of these people in light of Stiegler's concepts of entropy and anti-entropy, which will be so essential to his movement towards a philosophy of life, this work will have to be taken at some point in the future. Even without that requisite groundwork, though, I think we can see this concept of life taking the form of relentless productivity. This life concept of life as a kind of messily metaphysicalized combination of productivity and competition that stems from both neoliberalism and its obsession with Darwinism and competition. We can see this life concept of life culminating in the reversal of death into zombified life or bare life that becomes coextensive with the self-exploitation identified by Byung-Chul Han with relentless work and the end of all withdrawal from public visibility, played out in the fetishization of transparency. Now, when Byung-Chul Han says all this, he's pointing out that just as the Western obsession with freedom becomes inseparable from control, so our obsession with vitality or with life as striving for productivity tips over into its very opposite, namely burnout. The diseases that Han describes in the Gemütsgesellschaft, the diseases that Han describes as the immunologically triggered infarctions of burned out society include Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, Tourette's, depression, ADHD, and addictive disorders. These diseases overlap strikingly with those categorized by Catherine Malabou under the rubric of the new wounded, which is to say pathologies of a plastic brain relentlessly pushed to adapt to the point where it implodes. The same set of disorders are at the heart of what the psychologist Fred Previck calls hyperdopaminergic society, the pathologies of which are less the disinclinations to work of Foucault's disciplinary society than diseases of waning appetition. The dopaminergic balance of the Stone Age brain lasted until around the second half of the 20th century, since when the intensification of market economics and globalization have pushed us even further towards a dopamine-dominated striatum, and illnesses that correspond to a dysregulation of the overburdened reward system on which we rely for dealing with stress. So Previck's argument here is that over the course of human history, dopamine, which he'll say is the neurotransmitter linked not just to learning, but to coping with anxiety, it's linked to exploration, spatial navigation, and he'll say its increasing dominance we need to reread as being fundamental to the growth of not just European Enlightenment because of the role it plays in abstract thinking, but also it becomes a significant factor in something like the history of colonialism because of the role it plays in acquisitiveness and spatial conquest too. Previck will say that we pass through the history of society that is increasingly organized around dopamine up until the point in the late 20th century with consumerism, where it plays such a role in the brain that we've got a dysregulation of dopamine relative to other neurotransmitters like epinephrine, norepinephrine, adrenaline, and Others, the effect of which is going to lead to a variety of diseases, which just so happen to be the ones that Byung-Chul Han talks about in terms of burnout, Catherine Malabou talks about in terms of the new wounded. These are the diseases that stem from plastic, adaptable, flexible bodies no longer able to cope with the environmental stresses that are placed on them. I'd say another way of conceiving these cluster of diseases would be very much in terms of what Hans Selye, so often cited by Georges Canguilhem in Le Normal et le Pathologique, will call maladies of adaptation. In other words, diseases, pathologies stemming from an excess absorption of environmental pressures to the point where, in Malabou's terms, we bend and we bend and we bend and can no longer push back in the opposite direction, and it simply end up exploding or undergoing breakdown of one form or another. Now, so we end up with this scenario then, where a metaphysicalized concept of life in terms of relentless productivity, linked in turn to competition, collapses in on itself and demonstrates itself as becoming intolerable. There are numerous examples that we can give to illustrate how this plays out in practice. We know, for example, there's a really interesting new line of research in psychiatry from people like Edward Bullmore, who'll point out that, Bullmore's interested is in Alzheimer's disease, and he'll suggest that Alzheimer's disease is caused by short-term adrenaline responses to dealing with stress, lead to levels of scarring and inflammation in the microglia of the brain that leave us long-term increasingly incapable of neuroplasticity. Very similar arguments emerge in the work of someone like Ronald Duman, Yale psychiatrist who died this year, who'll come up with the synaptogenetic theory of depression that tells us that depression increasingly looks to be the product of short-term stress alleviating responses to environmental change, mapping onto longer-term depletions in capacity for neuroplastic learning and creation of new synaptic connections. Now, why this becomes significant in the time of something like COVID-19 is because that we know that one of the factors in the major factors in accounting for the significance of COVID-19 are very much linked to the lifestyles of high-intensity work and sedentary screen-based living in the 21st century. It is what we would call a syndemic rather than a pandemic. Its effects are decidedly exacerbated by the difficulties of our living circumstances. What do we mean by this? Well, one of the major factor that kicks in with COVID on day 9 or 10 or thereabouts is that we get cytokine storms where the immune system goes into overdrive and ends up leading to severe forms of sepsis that are often linked to COVID-related deaths. We know that one of the major baseline factors in the severity of these cytokine storms is going to be how much baseline inflammation is already present in patients at this moment. And factors affecting that baseline level of inflammation will include mental illness, lack of exercise, obesity, all the kind of standard symptoms that we associate with overwork, with food addiction, with sedentary lifestyles. So we might make a point here. I won't have time to make it. I won't make it about the connection between Stiegler's emploi, the prevalence of emploi over travail, and the extent to which proletarianized modes of living have already rendered us susceptible to contagion. Now, I want to shift, and I've only got about 3 minutes left, so I'll do this quite quickly. Come on to this concept of life, understood not as relentless productivity, not as competition, but as intermittence. And I realize that there's a vast amount of work that remains to be done to smooth out the gaps between these conceptions. So Stiegler himself never wrote a great deal about the concept of intermittence, save for fairly frequent but habitually underdeveloped references to an obscure French social welfare payment made to resting workers in the entertainment industries, the intermittent du spectacle. We'll see in due course that the idea of intermittent work is fundamental to Stiegler's refoundation of society around an economy of contribution, where work is communally financed insofar as it proves valuable to developing a neganthropic locality, and where workers' community work earns them the right to intermittent periods of paid focus on their own self-growth. Now, I'm not going to be able to talk about that today, but hopefully it will come up in the discussions of Plaine Commune further down the line. So, before we get to those discussions, though, we need to unpack Stiegler's more theoretical development of intermittence, which occurs for the first time in Prendre Soin from 2008 and paves the way for understanding its centrality in his later work on neganthropy. The claim made in Prendre Soin is that we are only ever intermittently non-inhuman, the default state of we noetic technical beings abandoned to technicity by default, which is to say, in the absence of any essential qualities, not humanity, but inhumanity, consisting in the drive-based, pulsional, or automated behaviors to which we always inevitably and entropically regress. We tend, Stiegler writes, vers l'être inhumain, with which we break only through moments of disautomation and par intermittence. The idea is revisited more fully in Dans la Disruption from 2016, where Stiegler identifies intermittent moments of noetic rupture with the figure of life itself, or negentropy by the image of the flying fish that served as the logo of his online school and summer academy, pharmacon.fr. L'intermittence noétique, c'est-à-dire ce que j'ai appelé depuis la logorée du poisson volant, as he'll put it in Dans la Disruption. The reason for intermittence, Stiegler argues there, is that the cure, the pharmacon, is also always a poison. Le pharmacon curatif finit toujours par devenir toxique. And as we adjust to a new technology through the reorganization of society and an adoption of new norms, the liberating disautomations that it made possible lapse into new habits or automated behaviors. Despite naive assumptions to the contrary, Stiegler doesn't think that this kind of automation is inherently negative. On the contrary, it can amount to learning, but I think that we can argue here that learning and addiction are neurologically indistinguishable. Both stem from our adaptation and subsequent desensitization to the dominant modes of environmental stimulus, leaving us both inattentive to other modes of stimulation and craving for more of the same.
Sorry, Gerald. In principle, the time is over, so could you please wrap up now? It's in order to, sorry.
Absolutely fine. You've saved me from having to extemporize. So I would say, I simply throw these out as lines that we need to follow up at some point in Stiegler's work. How are we going to make the transition from his thinking about the intermittence of life and seeing as that as the basis for reorganizing society around a concept of intermittence, where it's absolutely apparent, not just from the current pandemic, but from every other form of mental illness afflicting us, that the concept of life as relentless productivity and competition simply isn't working. I'll leave that there. Thank you.